Welcome everybody to the first interview fireside chat that we're hosting here at the Institute for Security Science and Technology. Today we are joined by Professor Denise Garcia for this chat. And just before we get into introducing ourselves, or I get into introducing Denise, I'll just tell you a little bit about the Institute for Security Science and Technology. So the Institute is we're part of Imperial College. We're a global challenge institute that is really looking to how science and technology can contribute to the missions around security and defense, but more importantly, looking at security in a much wider context and trying to see how science and technology can help to promote stability, equitable conditions, and really sustainable peace as the real route to providing global security or achieving global security. My name is Deeph Chana. I am the co-director of that institute, and I've got to say the reason that we have Denise with us today is because last year, in the middle of the pandemic, I was reading a copy of Nature, and I saw a really interesting article that happened to be authored by Denise, and it was really around the whole concept of whether or not military budgets are actually useful at all, in fact, and whether or not they have been very misdirected when we look at significant global risks to the climate and risks such as the pandemic. So I think it's fair to say the main contention or the main comment of the piece was, in fact, that governments have their priorities all wrong. And when we looked at the pandemic, it was very clear that all of that investment and all of that infrastructure couldn't really be brought to bear on this problem, right? It didn't really seem to be effective. And also, I think it was very interesting to read, Denise, your point about the fact that weapons don't really tackle the root cause of instability. The issues that we really have to deal with are poor governance, lack of resources, and lack of opportunities, poor education, these kind of things. And in fact, we're just not addressing those issues maybe in as serious a way as we might. So just to quickly introduce Professor Garcia, Denise is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Northeastern University. I hope I got that right, Denise.
Yes.
And Denise focuses research on international law, and really the questions around lethal robotics, artificial intelligence, the global governance of security, and the formation of new international norms and their impacts on peace and security. So we couldn't be talking to a better person as we start thinking about, what are the kind of ethics and norms that things like AI or technologies like AI and machine learning need to have baked within them, all the considerations we have to have when we start thinking about their use in security and defense applications. Denise is recipient of Northeastern College's the Social Science and Humanities Outstanding Teaching Award in 2016. And in 2017, very importantly for this discussion, Denise was appointed to the International Panel for the Regulation of Autonomous Weapons. And also I know there's a lot of work with the United Nations around this whole subject of lethal autonomous weapons. Denise, maybe I have missed something out of this amazing biography that you have, but maybe you could give us a bit more introduction to yourself and fill in the missing gaps.
Thank you so much, Professor Chana. It's an honor to be with you. I am delighted to be in this first event with you. I'm a big fan of the work of your institute. Deep, I am the vice chair of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, and that has been for a few years. In that capacity, and also as in the capacity of member of the International Panel for the Regulation of Autonomous Weapons, I have been observing the conversations at the United Nations, mainly in Geneva, but also in other diplomatic capitals like New York, Brussels, in conversations with NATO on the discussions on autonomous weapons. And I'm a big fan of constructive classroom interaction with my students. In that capacity also, I'm responsible for our annual course at the United Nations in Geneva, and that has been happening since 2007. So I take a group of students for a month to understand the role of the United Nations in world politics, but also other organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross.
That's amazing. And I've had the pleasure of interacting with some of your students at Northeastern University as well. And you get a very diverse bunch of people together. And we're really trying to create this sort of diverse conversation around security. So it's been really fascinating for me personally to have met you and also to see the kind of work that you're doing with the students. So look, we had a few questions. This is supposed to be quite a casual chat. And one of the first things that I wanted to ask you, really motivated by your article, but also some of the things that I've been thinking about and my colleagues at Imperial have been thinking about when we talk about security, is, what does it actually mean to make society secure? Do you think we've got to really have a good handle on this, or a common definition?
Oh, Deep, this is a question that is fascinating. And as you state in your institute's welcome statement, security is often viewed through the lenses of conflict and war. And you are rightly challenging, I think, in the work of your institute, this narrow perception of what security is. So, Deep, I would say for most of the 20th century, security was understood as the absence of war between the major powers, lack of military threats, and challenges from one defined enemy. So this is the traditional understanding of security, the national security. So it has these three dimensions, right? One is how states prepare to wage war. The other is the protection of the national territory against external threats of a military nature again. And thirdly, the protection of the state against defined enemies that typically pose a threat of a military nature. So from these three dimensions, Deep, security therefore can be defined as the pursuit of strengthening the state through the procurement of arms, of weapon systems to protect the national territory against this perceived military and known enemies. With the end of the Cold War, and the demise of this obvious military threat in the bipolar confrontation, the need to enlarge this concept of security appeared. There was a dissatisfaction, I would say, right, with this state-centric focus of security. So the broadening of security encompassed the inclusion of a wide variety of themes and issues that were prior considered low security issues, such as the environment and global public health. Imagine these are at the forefront now, but back then they were elevated, right? Deep, and I will argue for you that this was the first expansion of the concept of security, right? So from national security to human security, to include human security, to allocate a space for the security of individuals in each state, for communities in each state, right? Allocating a place of concern for protecting people. But at that moment, we had no maps of action on how to properly carry this out, right? So the definition of human security, Deep, is something that I would love to discuss with you and see, of course, what you think, right? What that is, but the delivery of the governance, of the global governance goods like security, rule of law, that would be part, right, of human security. But I would say, Deep, and I will argue that, and I thought of that for our conversation here, and you and I eventually can write a piece about that, but we are in the midst of a second expansion of the concept of security, of the practice of security. And this expansion, I will argue to you, it started in 2015, and I will tell you why 2015 was a very important year. We had the Paris agreements, we had the Sustainable Development Goals negotiated, and this marked a new phase where global maps of action were designed, right, Deep. And in the second expansion of the concept of security, I would argue that everybody's faith is inextricably connected. So we are now in a moment of humanity's security. So from national security to human security to humanity security, where my faith here in the United States, or the faith of my parents in Brazil, and your faith in the United Kingdom and the fate of people in China, people in Sweden, in Russia, we're all interconnected.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And the indicator of that is the vaccines right now. If we are all going to be safe when everybody is safe. So it's a globalized understanding of human security, humanity security.
So I'm really interested in this idea, Denise, that you're just talking about, which is the fact that, you know, potentially the actual human element, the humanity, the individual sort of element of what it means to be secure is lost in the big sort of national security debate. I mean, is that what you're sort of driving at? That previously, I think that that we talk so much about nation security and national security that maybe there isn't enough time, you know, pause to actually go back and say, well, what does security actually mean for individual citizens? What is it that they care about, right?
Exactly. Deep, I think it is not only lost, but it's not well taken care of. And the pandemic has put this into a new light, right?
Yeah.
So despite the fact that human security, humanity's security is what matters, is what we need to keep our eyes on, we have states talking about national security. I just read the UK's review.
Mhm.
That you kindly shared with me, defense posture review. It's still about the external enemies, the way countries constitute their armies, the bureaucracies of the armed forces, is still for this defined enemy that is of a military nature, whereas the enemy is inside each country, which are, of course, the known military threats that we're all facing now.
Yeah, and then do you think, I mean, what do you think when you look at things like what's just happened over the last 12 months with the pandemic? And we've seen serious civil unrest emerge from the pandemic for so many different reasons. And then you look at climate change as well as these these big sort of systemic global risks, if you like, and the pandemic has been a proper example of it because people have argued about climate change, you know, whether or not it is in fact a threat. But the pandemic has demonstrably shown a kind of risk that everybody faces, and it breaks down all of those barriers that you're talking about. It doesn't respect borders, etc. But do you think that actually we have adequately learned, or we are learning the lessons from the pandemic? I know your article sort of said, well, look, you know, we don't have the right situation right now to deal with something like that. But do you feel that we are changing or learning now from what's happened, or do you feel that it's pretty much going to stay the same?
Deep, I think the learning is taking place now, right? Of course, the greatest minds, in organizations such as the World Health Organization, CEPI, the Vaccine Alliance, at the Office of the UN Secretary General, who is extremely aware of all this, Antonio Guterres. And indeed, we need to bridge this disconnect between what each country really needs to be secure and this continuation of this old ordained ways to carry out security, right? So, and as we know, the price of ensuring human security is much less than of course, carrying out wars. So the price to implement the Paris agreements, the cost of carrying out the sustainable development goals is of course much less than maintaining this constant $2 trillion a year of military expenditure and the cost of war. So in Deep, what I understand now is that obviously, during the Cold War, we had this bipolar military confrontation. And of course, that was the main challenge, perhaps. But now, what I see very concerning is this threat challenge build up that China and Russia are the concern, are the biggest enemies. But on top of that, we have the pandemics, the next pandemic to prevent. We have climate change to tackle, the climate chaos, really. So that is this threat build up at the intersection of what we have, the real threats to the non-military nature, are of great concern. And of course,
yeah. Sorry, Denise, and I think you know, to get what you're saying, and I agree with this, is really that potentially the eyes are still not on the target here, and the pandemic is maybe showing a very clear lesson, and perhaps it's not being listened to as much as it should be. But I wanted to sort of expand on this idea of the SDGs and their centrality to this idea of security. How do you feel that they are central to the ideas and missions of security? You know, because the postures that you talk about, traditionally the military postures, are not necessarily aligned with the SDGs. Do you think, you know, which one do you think is going to take primacy in terms of importance, or do you think there will be there will be a convergence between the two? And then how do you think the defense system, how does it play into then working in an environment where we are aiming for the SDGs? Does it have a role?
Right, definitely, Deep. So for me, the SDGs are the first real global map for action for all countries. So when we had the Millennium Development Goals, you know, these were obligations, these were avenues for action, and a lot for the developing countries to meet the targets, for them to meet the goals, for them to meet. The SDGs are the first global map where everybody is involved, developed and developing countries. And of course, the pandemic is shown again, as you say, that nobody's secure until everybody's secure. And of course, the SDGs are diplomatic, are pragmatic, they are data-driven. Deep, I always look at their metadata website, all the information on implementing and how much we are meeting and how much we're losing now because of the pandemic. So yes, so the SDGs are the way to deliver security in terms of implementing the societal goals, societal values that should be at the heart of security and defense.
So do you see them as a pathway potentially for minimizing the risk of conflict? You know, kind of, if we get those right, then I guess the argument might be then, why will there be conflict if we can manage to sort of solve those SDGs? Is that kind of what the perspective is that you have?
I think so, Deep. I think they also work as a platform for action, platform for convergence of ideas, of diplomatic venues. The way they were negotiated is extremely exciting as well. We had these different countries put together in triads, so Brazil, Nicaragua, and Sweden, countries that perhaps don't have a lot in common at first sight, but they have a lot in common if they think about ways to negotiate, to implement these goals now. So yes, they definitely represent a platform for action, and also to create political avenues for action where there is known, for example, the climate refugees. This is already occurring. Right, the refugees that are coming here to the United States from Central America, these are climate refugees because, of course, Central American countries were devastated by this different number of different hurricanes that just happened, that cost their economy billions of dollars, and they have no way to pay for the reparation. So we don't have under international law a framework for climate refugees. That's not in the Refugee Convention, right? So the Refugee Convention is a framework that is useful, but it's not encompassing all the new challenges we have. So the SDGs could create that platform for, you know, putting soft law and soft law avenues onto patching the lacuna and the gaps, until we make new agreements on how to properly commonly agree to deal with problems such as climate change.
Yeah, and I really agree with you. I mean, I think actually that if we focus our efforts on the SDGs, and we think about security and defense really being the primary mission, being to minimize conflict, really, because I don't think anybody sensible celebrates conflict. Let's put it that way. I think there are people who potentially do celebrate it, but I'm not so sure how sensible they are. But I think that has to be the rational way to go, right? And the question really then is, you know, how much effort are we putting in place? I suppose 2015 is relatively not that long ago in terms of the timescale of these things. So maybe we're just at the beginning of the journey. But one of the things one of the things I'm interested in then is, we just had this very interesting lecture on our Briscoe lecture by Jeremy Fleming from GCHQ. And there we were talking about the possibilities that technology gives to us as a society, right? And we have decisions to make. The way that we implement technologies can take us down negative pathways or positive pathways, and it's up to us to figure out what we want to do. And one of those technologies, of course, that everybody talks about is systems and things like that. And I know you're really hot on this topic, on this idea of kind of the legal and ethical considerations around using autonomy and AI in our defense activities and our security activities. What would you say is the current status of this very kind of, it's a very contentious debate right now, right? I mean, where do you see the current status lying? And do you think we have a good set of shared values and norms for how this stuff will be used? And what do you think the risks are surrounding this whole thing?
Right. Well, Deeph, I would say we are in precarious grounds, I would say. So there has been conversations going on. There have been conversations going on at the United Nations, mostly in Geneva since 2014. These conversations started informally, and then they moved to more formal conversations in 2017. Deeph, and all we have as a result thus far is a set of principles for guiding the use on autonomous weapons. A few countries are very adamantly opposed to any sort of international regulation. So obviously, and this stands in contrast to the fact that most countries in the world would welcome international regulation, would welcome a new treaty that would clarify the expectations, that would say, well, international humanitarian law, which is the laws of war, they apply certainly to the systems. But what is now, with machine learning coming into question in already being deployed in certain parts of the operations of certain systems, what will that mean for us, right? And when you addressed my students, Deeph, and I was very, very excited to hear you speak, you addressed the question of the black box, the unpredictability that arises from operations using machine learning. So imagine the challenges of using that in a war, in an operational context where you don't know what the machine is going to be learning from the environment, right? The system will be learning from the environment. So it's unlikely that we'll be able to meet all the requirements of international humanitarian law and other parts of international law, Deeph, such as human rights law, state responsibility. What about central to human rights law is human dignity? Will human dignity be upheld? So this is all very unclear. And I can go into the negotiations, but of course, I would say we need to reformulate perhaps the way negotiations are taking place. The forum where they're taking place in this question is not the appropriate one. And I can go on.
So this is fascinating, actually. And I know we're coming a little bit to the end of the time, but I think there are many unique features of machine learning and AI, and you mentioned one of them. This sort of black box thing. I mean, do you think what do you think the other unique features might be? I mean, I think from what I can hear from what you're saying, and when we've talked about this before, is that potentially there needs to be a whole new way of creating policy and regulation that matches the sort of game-changing nature of the technology that we're seeing kind of emerge at the moment.
Exactly, Deeph. So I think because of the way machine learning and other techniques within the umbrella of artificial intelligence are already being deployed in the systems, Deeph, I would say the most important is to create an international obligation to maintain human control, to maintain meaningful human control. And we don't have that, Deeph. So that is a lacuna in international humanitarian law right now and other parts of international law Therefore, if we create a new treaty on that, it's not going to be in the modes of any of the previous treaties on arms control. Deep, we're talking about something completely novel. So of course the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, even the Montreal Protocol that is protecting our ozone layer, that these are very exciting treaties that are successful, that created customary obligations under international law that everybody abides to, but even the great powers. So these are, it's of course, so we need to create a treaty that would be of a different nature, that would create positive obligations to maintaining human control.
Yeah. And do you think it's got to be that pathway, right? There has to be positive obligations, because my concern with these things is that even if you create these treaties, how enforceable are they, right? Unless there are positive reasons to adhere to them, surely people would just, circumvent them and get around them anyway. And policing that and deciding who should be checking to see that these conventions are upheld seems to me that could be a big problem.
Yes, Deep, you touched on the $1 billion question there, and I'm not, I have so many colleagues who are leading that discussion there, Deep. But I would say, Deep, so if we step back a little bit, so again, on what we're saying before, so where do we have convergence of interest right now amongst the superpowers, and even the major powers? So where do they all converge? So China, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Brazil, India, they all have an interest in tackling the climate crisis. They all have an interest in preventing the next pandemic, right? So if we perhaps use in this summit yesterday and today hosted by the American President Joe Biden is very auspicious, very, very welcoming, because it can create spaces where the great powers are seeing eye to eye. And that's an issue that China and the US are going to cooperate together. I have great hopes. So if we build goodwill, good faith in this area, Deep, we can build good faith for other areas. This area that you mentioned, right? So I have great hopes that in that regard.
That's fantastic. And I know we've just got just wanted to close off with one more question, really, and that is, quite often the issue of what's happening certainly with AI and machine learning and autonomy, many people equate it to the kind of existential risks that nuclear weapons pose, right? And I wondered if you could just comment a little bit on what you think we can learn about how we've dealt with nuclear weapons that will help to guide us to not make the same mistakes this time round, or maybe we got it right the first time round. I don't know. I don't happen to think we're in a very good spot right now, but maybe you've got a different view.
Exactly. Well, Deep, there are great strides that were made with tackling nuclear weapons. So, so at one point we had perhaps 70,000 nuclear weapons now, and now we're down to a little over 11,000, right? So there has been a lot of success that was achieved, and I would say through bilateral treaties, especially between the US and the Russians who hold the greatest numbers of arsenals, but also through the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, right? So the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, really created a system where proliferation we tried to limit proliferation, right? And I think that in large part has been achieved in the decrease of the arsenal as well. However, Article 6 of the NPT says that, the haves, the ones that have nuclear weapons, have to reach a nuclear zero. Have they done that? Not yet. So, of course, with that, meanwhile, the rest of the world, the ones that do not have nuclear weapons and are using perhaps this technology of the atom for the common good, creating energy and for other uses, they have done two things, Deep. They have on one hand, they have created nuclear weapon-free zones, and those are about 6 international treaties that allocated parts of the globe to be, most of the globe actually, to be nuclear weapon-free. And on the other hand, these countries created a fascinating new avenue, new international legal avenue, that is the Nuclear Ban Treaty. And that was negotiated in 2017, mostly led by the efforts of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So campaigners from all over the world, in partnership with a few countries, medium powers, Costa Rica, Brazil, Ireland, Austria, etc. They have worked to come up with this treaty, Deep, that has created a new normative a new norm banning nuclear weapons.
Right.
So, Deep, I would say for the artificial intelligence systems and for the weapons of the present and the future, it would be an enormous waste of energy to create, to proliferate, to have all the systems, and then to bring them down through treaties, through diplomatic action, as I'm describing to you. I think we need to have a small window of opportunity now to prevent the proliferation before it reaches those heights. And we must focus all our firepower, all our economic, intellectual firepower to instead implement the Sustainable Development Goals in full faith, carry out the Paris agreements to tackle climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more on that, and I think that's a big problem. Is that I think the lesson that you do learn from things like nuclear weapons is you don't, as you said, proliferation is the problem, and then you're kind of backtracking from it, and there's an opportunity now not to get to that point and maybe be a little bit ahead of the curve this time round. And it's fascinating to see whether we will achieve that. Denise, thank you so much for agreeing to do this today. It's the first sort of chat like this we're doing, and it's been fascinating to talk to you again, as it always is. And so thank you so much for your time. And well, I hope to speak to you again soon. I'm sure we will. And I'm hoping that we can collaborate more and more between Northeastern University and what we're doing over at Imperial College with the Institute for Security Science.
Deep, it was an honor. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to the next times. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. Bye-bye.